Good evening. It's Friday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Eum Ji-young filling in for Kim Bo-kyung. Over the past few weeks, South Korea has been battered by on and off torrential downpours. This has led to the deaths of around 50 people and many others injured. Some remain missing. Thousands have evacuated from their homes due to landslides and flash floods. But it's not the only rain that has been gripping Korea. The country has been experiencing unusual temperatures, with the mercury hitting the highest in more than 2 decades. And it's not just a crisis here in South Korea, but also around the world. For more on this, we're joined by Moon Woo-sok Assistant Professor of Environmental Atmosphere at Pukyong National University, and Mr. David Cox, health journalist at The Guardian. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So, Professor
thanks
Moon,
for having me.
Thank you. So, Professor Moon, we want to start with you. South Korea's weather agency has announced an official end to this year's summer monsoon season with record precipitation. But the weather agency also said that South Korea is still seeing sudden torrential rain and heat waves. So, how is this related to climate crisis?
Actually, it is a little bit hard to connect this one event to climate crisis. But I think I have two evidence to connect this one. One is moisture amount in the air. Because of the temperature rise, the amount of the moisture in the air could increase. And then this one could be transported to the Korean peninsula from low latitude. I mean, that can cause this kind of extreme flooding. And then secondly is because of the global warming, the high latitude area temperature rise faster. But in the case, the middle latitude wind speed could decrease, and this could intensify the local regional climate patterns. I think a summer monsoon pattern could be intensified, and then this one can cause the unexpected torrential rain and extreme weather. I mean, because of that, I think this one could be connected with climate crisis.
So it's certainly related to the global warming then. Again to you, Professor Moon, this year we saw a tragedy with the deadly underpass flooding in Osong in the central city of Cheongju that took 14 lives, as well as with landslides in other parts of the country. I mean, it is of course important to tackle climate change as the first priority, but to prevent this kind of disaster from happening again, how should the disaster preventive system in South Korea be improved?
But first of all, I mean, we know that some region which is quite weak to this kind of extreme flooding. So we must prepare for that in advance, maybe for the next year's situation. I think this situation could continue again and again the next year, 2 years after. And then second, we have to improve our forecast system. So we must predict this situation in advance at the right time. For that, I mean, we must improve our scientific research to know the situation exactly in principle. I mean, that kind of effort should be done quite quickly to improve our forecast system.
So a lot of efforts to be done then. Now I'd like to ask you, Mr. Cox, it's not just South Korea that's being hit by the climate crisis. It's affecting all corners of the globe. In fact, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says that the era of global warming has ended and the era of global boiling has arrived. So what's your take on this?
Yes, well, the idea of global boiling is frankly quite terrifying, especially here in the UK, where we're pretty much ill-prepared to deal with this. So most of our houses, offices, and our railways are not built to withstand this kind of sustained hot weather. Also, like the UK, we're an island, and we're also seeing sea levels steadily rising, which is going to make coastal homes far more vulnerable. So there's lots of problems which are coming from this. I mean, and one of the main solutions probably here is going to be basically to use more air conditioning inside. But this also, at the same time, risks making the climate change problem even worse because air conditioning is a significant source of carbon emissions. So we really do have like a grave need of better solutions and thinking to try and tackle the climate crisis.
Well, using a lot of air conditioning is also a big problem here. Professor Moon, U.S. President Joe Biden on Thursday took steps to protect workers from what he describes as the real crisis of extreme weather, as around 150 million Americans are under heat alerts. So how dangerous are the high temperatures there in the U.S.?
But as a matter of fact, right now, the ocean temperature around the U.S. is extremely high. So because of that, we are seeing that extreme heat wave situation. And some area, the temperature is over 40 Celsius degree, which is quite dangerous to people working outside. I'm also worrying about the situation because to move the society, someone must work outside. But however, the society never prepared for this kind of situation, and then somebody must work to move society. But it is highly dangerous to work outside for some time. So the U.S. must prepare for the situation. Like Joe Biden said, the U.S. government should suggest a way to prevent this kind of a disastrous situation.
Right. And to you, Mr. Cox, the climate crisis is affecting all parts of the world. And we've seen record temperatures in China and heat waves across North Africa and Southern Europe sparking wildfires. So could you give us details of how serious the heat waves and wildfires have been in those places?
You're right. I mean, we've seen absolutely devastating scenes in these regions. And we saw this last summer as well. And I think the scary thing is it seems to be becoming an annual event. We're getting these temperatures of more than 40, 50, and even up to 60 degrees Celsius, which is unprecedented. And so as a result, we've had thousands of people this summer already in Southern Europe and Northern Africa have been made homeless by the fires. Like the entire Mediterranean Sea has been kind of covered in this sort of smoky haze resulting from all these fires. And in the UK, it's been in the news here pretty much all the time because hundreds of tourists in Greece and Italy have basically become stranded because flights home have been cancelled and people have been evacuated from their hotels. So it's very, very serious. And the fact that this is happening every year really does show that we need to start investing more, as not just in like climate change prevention, but also just wildfire prevention measures.
Right. And Professor Moon, climate scientists point out that the human-caused climate crisis is undeniably to blame for such deadly heat waves. Climate Watcher World Weather Attribution also underlines that without human-induced climate change, such events would be extremely rare. So how do you view this?
I'm not sure about the meaning of extreme rare, actually. I mean, without climate change, some natural climate cycle also exists. Depending on the phase of the cycle, we might expect this kind of extreme flooding and drought. But however, it is for sure that global warming is influencing that situation. Like, the probability of such an event is increasing. I mean, I think that is for sure. But however, it is an attribution study. It is just a comparison between two situations with global warming and without global warming. But it is suggesting some probability issue for this kind of event. But what we have to know for sure is dynamical connection, the theoretical understanding, how climate crisis is connected with this kind of a situation. With this knowledge, we could prevent such an event under reliable forecast. That's my opinion about it.
Now, Mr. Cox, the climate crisis could definitely have an impact on human health, especially heat waves, as this summer heat is already behind many heat-related deaths. And what kind of health-related hospital admissions have we seen so far, and what other health crises could be caused by the climate change?
Well, excessive heat, what happens is it puts humans under a lot of physical stress. So during these really, really intense heat waves, you'll see people developing a condition called heat stroke, which is where the body becomes unable to cool itself. It just can't remove the heat like so quickly enough. And then that can, in really serious cases, cause damage to the internal organs, and that leads to death. And people with chronic health conditions are particularly vulnerable to this because they're often on certain medications, which mean they already struggle to hydrate themselves well enough. So they're the people who often tend to be really badly affected by this. But at the same time, scientists are becoming more worried, particularly in Asia and countries like India, about something called ozone pollution, which stems from high heat, because increasing heat causes different chemicals to react in the atmosphere, which creates ozone. And this is a problem because ozone is toxic to the body. It causes damage to the respiratory system and aggravates different lung problems such as asthma. So air pollution, heat stroke, these are all kind of increasing problems which we're going to see from this global boiling, basically.
Yes, they're all serious problems. And again, to you, Mr. Cox, many other problems are stemming from a change in weather patterns, and that includes climateflation, which means that global warming could contribute to a rise in living costs. So could you tell us more about what this is?
Yes, it's not just health. I mean, a lot of people don't realize this, but climate change does directly affect the cost of the food we buy. So as an example, last year, the cost of eggs in the US rose by 60%. And this is entirely due to the fact that growing feed for chickens is becoming more expensive as we're seeing more of these heat waves. Growing certain vegetables is also more costly because farmers have to deal with more extremes in weather and having to deal with more pests, which you also get when it becomes warmer. So high heat also, it affects the cost of things like clothes because you get power and internet outages in warehouses, and that means transporting products around the world becomes more and more expensive. So yes, climate change is costing each of us in lots of different hidden ways.
Yes, I think climateflation is also a problem here in South Korea as well. And I have a similar question to you, Professor Moon. A study says the climate crisis will push up global food prices, leading up to a rise of 3 percentage points in food inflation. So what could be done to tackle this issue?
Yeah, actually, many people could think that global warming is related to other industrial areas like agriculture and finance. I mean, everybody easily guess it is related. But however, the difficult thing is that, I mean, what is the mechanism of this connection? How the global warming could affect agriculture prices? And how this one could be connected with other industry like electricity and some energy industry. I mean, everything is connected like a web. However, academic world is a little bit hard to kind of infuse all situation and then judge this situation in all aspect. It is quite difficult. Climate scientists must cooperate with other fields of scientists and experts, but it is quite hard. But from now on, I mean, we have to find a way to gather some knowledge from different areas, and then we know how to use this knowledge efficiently and wisely to the right situation. So definitely global warming could worsen the situation in all aspects. The agriculture prices and other industries might be affected, and we have to expect some kind of a dangerous situation in finance. But we have to know the mechanism to connect these kind of different things in one place. So maybe it is quite a big challenge in academic world. I mean, we have to do a lot of research quite swiftly.
Yes, you're right. And Mr. Cox, climate change is also set to increase the global crime rate as well. According to a World Economic Forum report, the global crime rate will rise by up to 5% by the year 2090. So how could that happen?
So that's quite interesting. I mean, there's a couple of links here. And the first one, which is perhaps in some ways the scariest one, is that people basically become more impulsive and aggressive when temperatures are high. We've seen that in lots of different research studies. So people just become more violent, essentially, when it's hot. But there's also a more subtle one here. So if we don't tackle climate change, you're going to get a lot more vulnerable people in societies around the world. And this is going to be because they've lost their homes. The cost of living has meant that they can't afford things. And with reduced economic opportunities for lots of people, then they become more susceptible to being recruited by organized criminal networks, being involved in crime. And so that is also going to contribute to the rising crime rate. So there are different factors here. And again, it just shows how urgently we need to try and do something to address this.
So, Mr. Cox, what are some of the measures that we can address this problem?
I think we just need to, invest in basically moving away from fossil fuels. I think that is the number one sort of contributor around the world to carbon emissions. And governments need to put a lot more money into research projects, studying renewable energy, alternative energy sources, perhaps things like electric planes, ways of transport, which, are just not causing this much damage to the environment.
I see. And again, to you, Mr. Cox, international and organizations say climate change exacerbates specific social issues, making women and underage girls become more exposed to crimes, making them become victims of double injustice. So could you give us more details on how it should be dealt with?
So yes, this is one of the awful realities, is that women often become victims of some of the worst consequences of climate change. So we've seen around the world that when women lose their family homes and they're forced to move due to things like wildfires or fires or floods, which have been sort of caused by climate change, they're at much greater risk of things like violence, human trafficking. And just to give you one example of that, in Peru, where you've had lots of traditional farmers have basically been forced to migrate to other countries because climate change has affected the quality of the soil, women there are much greater risk of being kidnapped by organized gangs. So there's lots of factors like this which make women, and particularly young girls, a lot more vulnerable. And basically governments just need to do more to look after the most vulnerable in society, including women, being aware that of these factors are going to become more and more common with climate change, and probably tightening laws to punish the perpetrators of gender violence a lot more strictly. I think those are the only things we can really do.
Right. And Mr. Cox, how are cities around the world adapting to climate change?
So I think in Europe, I know in South Korea, air conditioning is very, very common, and it is across a lot of Asia. I think in Europe, we're having to try and use air conditioning. We need to, our homes basically are actually built to keep us warm. They're built for colder temperatures. So we're starting to see governments investing more in newer homes, which are more adaptable and, able to cope with hotter temperatures. So that's one strategy. Another strategy which is being explored is trying to reduce the amount of concrete, and plant more trees in cities. That's one thing which has been done very effectively by Singapore. And you're starting to see cities looking more at things like that, which they can do to sort of create more of a cooling effect in the future. So there's factors like that. Also, again, just more research into renewable energy. Perhaps one of the, the advantages of global boiling is that solar energy will become more economical, and perhaps that can start to replace fossil fuels in different ways. But there's a lot of challenges, and we just need more of a united effort from all parties to try and tackle this.
So, Professor Moon, to prevent horrible outcomes from global warming, scientists say cutting emission is ever more urgent, and that governments need to agree to phase out fossil fuels at the UN Climate Summit COP28. So what should be done?
Yeah, I think because we know that CO2 is the reason for this global warming, so cutting emission is kind of a step we got to do quickly. I mean, that's for sure. But we have to remember that even if we cut down the emission, the immediate positive effect might not come out, because the current global warming is accumulated effect of a past CO2 accumulation. So this accumulated effect cannot be erased quite quickly, even though we act quickly right now. So we must know this fact. So cutting emission means we are doing something for the next generation. And then maybe for us right now, what we have to do is to understand the influence of the global warming, and then we have to prepare for this kind of a situation, new normal state, like extreme flooding and drought and those kind of things that will happen again and again in summer next year, maybe after 2 years. So we have to get used to this situation, and we have to know how to prevent from such an event. And then cutting emission is definitely one step we got to do right now.
So besides from cutting emission, what other measures can we take?
So cutting emission could be quite abstract term. For example, yeah, let's do this one. But in the case of someone might ask, yeah, what do I have to do individually? That's really quite ambiguous, quite ambiguous question. But what I want to say is that maybe in the near future, we have to change our way of lives, the cultural change. For example, right now, a lot of people are enjoying shopping outside for city life. That's a kind of activity we are enjoying, but we must stop that kind of activity right now. That is one example, we have to drop down convenience. It might be quite difficult because we get used to a lot of convenience stuff in city life, but we have to drop down those kind of things. So I want to call it cultural change, but unfortunately, we are in a step to do it quite quickly.
It's really sad that we have to stop going out shopping. And amid escalating climate crisis, many countries around the world are declaring to achieve carbon neutrality. So how are countries achieving this, Mr. Cox?
So they're taking different steps, such as, in trying to invest more in renewable energy, as I said before, and also I think just trying to, look at alternative solutions. I think things like one of the big news stories in the UK this week has been that the Gulf Stream, which it controls like a lot of the climate in Europe, could possibly collapse by 2025, and that's caused people to look for a lot of alternative solutions, trying to maybe find ways of making things more electric, promoting electric cars rather than conventional conventional cars, and perhaps in the future more research into things like electric planes. I think trying to find ways of promoting people to use public transport a lot more, things like trains, buses, but basically, a lot of countries, the UK in particular, is not doing a very good job of this at the moment. So, I think that's where a lot of people are becoming quite restless. They want more action. They want more urgency because, as Professor Moon said, we don't really have, time is not on our side. We need to act very quickly within the next 5 to 10 years. Otherwise, some of these changes are potentially going to become irreversible.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Moon and Mr. Cox, for your insights.
Thank you.
That's all for Within the Frame tonight. Thank you for watching. We'll be back next Monday with more in-depth stories. Until then, goodbye.